The rain poured down in relentless sheets, the storm turning the winding country road into a maze of slick asphalt and shadows. Jake squinted through the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Beside him, Rachel stared out the window, her face pale, tense. It had been hours since they had passed another car, hours since they had seen anything but trees bending in the wind and lightning splitting the night sky. "We need to find shelter," Jake muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I can barely see the road." Rachel didn't respond at first, just nodded absently. The oppressive weight of the storm pressed down on them, the sound of the rain hammering the car like the heartbeat of something immense and angry. She glanced at the gas gauge, almost empty. "There!" she exclaimed suddenly, pointing ahead. Through the sheets of rain, a flickering neon sign emerged like a beacon in the darkness. Vacancy. Jake felt a wave of relief. They could barely make out the outline of a small, isolated building nestled between the towering trees. It was an old two-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A large sign on the side read, "Clearwater Motel." They pulled into the empty gravel lot, the tires crunching over the loose stones. As the car came to a halt, the storm's fury seemed to intensify, as though trying to drive them away from the crumbling motel. But they had no choice. The gas was nearly gone, and there was no telling how far they would have to drive to find another shelter. Jake cut the engine, and for a moment, the world was reduced to the sound of the storm and their own breathing. "We don't have a choice," he said, glancing over at Rachel, whose unease was almost palpable. "Yeah," she whispered, but her eyes stayed locked on the building in front of them. There was something about it, something wrong. They grabbed their bags and dashed through the rain to the small office, the wind whipping around them, making every step a struggle. Inside, a dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the worn linoleum floor. The air smelled stale, of mold and something faintly metallic. A bell sat on the counter, old and tarnished. Jake rang it twice, the sharp sound cutting through the oppressive silence. After a few moments, a man shuffled out from a back room. He was hunched, with thin gray hair that clung to his scalp in damp strands. His skin was a sickly pale, and his eyes had a dull, glassy sheen, as if he hadn't slept in years. "Room?" the man asked in a voice like dried leaves rustling in the wind. "Yeah, just for the night," Jake said, forcing a smile. "We're passing through and need a place to stay until the storm lets up." The man stared at them for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Rachel in a way that made her stomach churn. Finally, he nodded slowly, his movements almost mechanical. He handed Jake a key, room 12, and muttered something under his breath that neither of them could make out. "What was that?" Jake asked, his tone polite but firm. The man didn't answer. He just turned and shuffled back into the shadows, disappearing through a door marked private. Rachel shivered and tugged at Jake's arm. "Let's just get to the room," she whispered, her eyes darting around the dingy office. Room 12 was at the far end of the building, up a narrow staircase with creaking steps. The hallway was dimly lit, the old-fashioned sconces on the walls flickering weakly. The walls themselves were lined with old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, giving the place an air of long-forgotten decay. When they entered the room, it wasn't much better. The bed was old and sagging, the carpet threadbare, and the single window was streaked with grime. A musty odor filled the air, as though the room hadn't been aired out in years. "Home sweet home," Jake said with a wry smile, trying to lighten the mood, but Rachel wasn't smiling. She stood near the door, her eyes scanning the room. "Something feels off," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake moved to her side and wrapped his arms around her. "It's just the storm and the fact that we're stuck in a creepy old motel. We'll be fine, we'll sleep, and in the morning we'll get out of here." She nodded, though her body remained tense. They unpacked their bags and tried to settle in for the night, but as soon as the lights were off, the unease that had gripped Rachel only deepened. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the window panes like someone, or something, was trying to get in. But it wasn't just the storm that made her skin crawl. There was something else, something in the walls. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible over the wind. At first, Rachel thought it was just her imagination, the result of too much tension and exhaustion. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. Voices. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, as though a crowd of people were murmuring just behind the thin walls. She couldn't make out the words, but there was something desperate, something angry about them. "Jake," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over. "Hear what?" "The voices in the walls." Jake sat up, rubbing his eyes. He listened, and for a moment, there was nothing but the storm outside. Then he heard it too, a soft, rhythmic whispering. His eyes widened, and he turned to Rachel. "What the hell is that?" They both got out of bed, moving cautiously toward the walls, pressing their ears against the peeling wallpaper. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable, and they were coming from inside the walls. "Is there someone else staying here?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe next door?" Jake shook his head. "No, the lot was empty when we pulled in. We're the only ones here." They stood in the center of the room, hearts racing, as the whispers grew more frantic, more insistent. Then, without warning, the sound of a woman screaming ripped through the air, followed by a chorus of anguished cries, echoing through the walls like a chorus of the damned. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." Jake grabbed his keys, and they headed for the door. But as they reached it, the handle wouldn't turn. Jake tugged harder, but it was stuck, as though something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, pulling with all his strength, but the door remained firmly closed. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more urgent, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Rachel could see her breath now, fogging the air in front of her. The smell of decay and blood filled her nostrils, and she gagged. Suddenly, the walls themselves seemed to shudder, and from the cracks in the wallpaper, something began to seep through, a dark, viscous liquid that dripped onto the floor in thick crimson rivulets. "Jake," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of voices. "What is happening?" Jake didn't answer. His eyes were wide with terror as he backed away from the door, his hands shaking. "We're not alone here," he finally whispered. "There's something in this place." As they stood frozen in the center of the room, a new sound joined the whispers and screams, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very foundation of the building. Suddenly, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. But the hallway outside wasn't empty. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and gaunt, its face pale and twisted, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. Behind it, shadowy shapes moved in the darkness, their forms indistinct, but filled with rage. Rachel screamed, and Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the window. They had no choice. The thing in the doorway was coming closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate, its breath a ragged hiss. Jake smashed the window with a chair, and they clambered through the jagged frame, cutting their hands on the broken glass. The storm outside was just as fierce, but it was better than whatever was inside the motel. They ran through the rain-soaked parking lot, the wind whipping around them, but as they reached the car, Jake fumbled with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the lock. Behind them, the thing from the motel was still coming, its pale figure barely visible through the sheets of rain. Finally, the car door opened, and they scrambled inside. Jake turned the key and the engine roared to life. He slammed the car into gear and peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying beneath the tires. As they sped down the road, the motel vanished into the storm, swallowed by the darkness. But the whispers remained, echoing in their minds, a constant reminder of the horror they had narrowly escaped. Hours later, they pulled into a gas station miles away, the storm finally abating. They sat in the car, breathing heavily, their clothes soaked, their bodies trembling. "Did that really happen?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his eyes wide and haunted. And then, from somewhere deep inside the car, they heard it again. A whisper. They weren't alone. Not anymore.